Welcome to another episode in England and America. This episode we're going to be talking about Jamestown, the first English colony in America. On the title slide in these PowerPoints, there are two maps. The smaller map shows the British Empire between 1600 and 1700. All the red shaded areas are those areas that were claimed as part of the British Empire. The larger map is a map that was created by Captain John Smith of the Jamestown area, the Powhatan villages are shown on the map. So we're going to talk a little bit about Jamestown, which will eventually become the Virginia colony. But first I want to make a general statement, an overall statement, if you will, about the two sections of the country. Jamestown will be the very first English colony, and it will be representative of all of the southern colonies. All the southern colonies will follow basically the same pattern as Jamestown in the Virginia colony. Then we have the Massachusetts colony in the north, which will be very representative of all of the colonies in the north. And each section takes a totally different course, so that my contention is that the roots of the Civil War can actually be seen right here in the early colonization period. So I have on the second slide comparing the southern colonies with the northern colonies. In the southern colonies, whether it's Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, or Georgia, or Maryland. Maryland was part of the southern colonies. They were founded by men from the aristocracy of England. Men who didn't work for themselves. They had everything done for them. They were the landowners. They had servants to do all of the work, even to the point of dressing them. They had men servants called valets who bathed them, shaved them, dressed them, combed their hair, did everything for them, besides having groomsmen to take care of their horses. So they were accustomed to doing very little, and in fact, in the aristocracy in England, you were betraying your class if you labored with your hands. Aristocratic men were supposed to be men of leisure. So most of those men who helped to found or establish the colonies in the South were from the aristocratic class in England. They were also Anglican. In the previous episode, we talked about how that Henry VIII took England out of the Catholic Church and created the Anglican Church. And since Henry VIII had not been religiously converted, rather doing it more for his own convenience, to get out from under the rule of the Pope, or the authority of the Pope, the Anglican Church kept a lot of the remnants of Catholicism. So these aristocrats were loyal members of the Anglican Church. They, in the southern colonies, what they established by means of economy or for profit was agriculture. Because what they found when they arrived in Jamestown and later the rest of what would be the Virginia colony was excellent soil, lots of rivers, streams, semi-tropical climate. In other words, perfect for agriculture. So what they are going to find to profit from is agriculture, tobacco to start with. Later it will be rice, indigo, and even later cotton. But the southern colonies will depend entirely on agriculture as the base of their economy. Also, what happens in the South, because these agricultural crops require a tremendous amount of land, because you can only plant tobacco or these other crops maybe 3 years in a row before you have to leave the ground fallow, and you have to have more land to be able to plant crops to get a good harvest. Because tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton all deplete the nutrients in the soil very quickly. So you can't get a good harvest if you plant the same field year after year after year. So these aristocrats, these landowners in the South, will need huge amounts of land so that they continue to get a good profit from the crops. And because the majority of the land is going to be taken up in planting these crops, it's going to be very sparsely populated. There'll be small towns, small settlements, and then these huge plantations. There will be very few cities in the southern colonies. So it's going to be rural. So the points that help to describe the southern colonies will be that they are settled by the aristocratic class, that they will be loyal Anglicans, that they depend on agriculture, they're sparsely populated, and they're rural. On the other hand, if we look at the northern colonies, we're going to find out that they are settled by middle-class families, Puritans. Now, Puritans were members of the Anglican Church, but they were members who wanted to purify the Anglican Church from all of its remnants of Catholicism. So these were people, members of the Anglican Church, who worked and who desired to purify the Church of England. So middle-class families, Puritan, and what they find when they get to Massachusetts Bay Colony or Plymouth, any of the other areas in the north, not very good soil. It's going to be really rocky, heavily forested. So it's not going to be good for agriculture. They're going to depend on commerce, doing business, shipbuilding, overseas trading, shops, artisans. So not agriculturalists. Now there will be some small farms, gardens for sustenance, not for cash crops. So their economy is going to be commercial. And they're going to be very densely populated, because when they come over, they're coming over in family groups. In fact, some whole congregations will travel together aboard ship to come to what will be called New England. And it was first called New England by John Smith, who had ventured from Jamestown on orders from James I to go up the coast to find other areas available for settlement. And so in that exploration, John Smith described the area as New England, and it would keep that designation. So it's going to be densely populated, a lot of towns, close neighbors. It's going to be very urban. So if you can see on the PowerPoint comparing the two sections, right from the beginning, they're entirely different without even talking about slavery. Slavery is not the only difference between the North and the South. In fact, in the next episode, when we talk about New England, the settlement of New England, we're going to see that they were first involved in the slave trade, and that they would be using slaves in the North. So if you thought that the Civil War, the difference between the North and the South, was simply the issue of slavery, that's not the case. They differed on almost every factor in their development. So they're going to develop entirely different cultures, different economic systems, different religious preferences. So I can't overemphasize how different the two sections of the country develop right from the very beginning. But we want to look this time at Jamestown, the very first English colony in America. It was created by, or the idea for, and the backing for the first expedition will be by the Virginia Company. Now, Virginia Company was a joint stock company, which was a relatively new way of doing business in England. Previous to this, individuals who wanted to send out an expedition either to the east, to the south, one individual would finance the whole expedition. If it failed, that man lost everything. If it was profitable, then he gained all of the profit. But it was a chancy way of doing business. So around 1580, England started developing these joint stock companies, which was where several investors would come together and they would pool their resources to back an expedition, to finance an expedition. Now this sounds very common to us because we've grown up with the knowledge of corporations, big companies with investors. But this, in the 1600s, this is a new way of doing business. So the Virginia Company was established by wealthy gentlemen in England, aristocrats. The goals of this company were commercial, to gain profit, but also they did have religious goals as well as national goals. Because when they went to King James to get permission, which anyone in Europe who was going to venture west to the Americas had to have the backing of their national authority, whether king, queen, whatever. So the Virginia Company sent representatives to King James to ask for his permission to accomplish this expedition to North America. That was 1606. So King James gave the men the charter, and in this charter they were given the permission to create a settlement between the 34th and the 45th parallel. So they had specific limitations to where they could establish this settlement. But also in the charter, the king gave them instructions that they should create a stable government and that they should take Christianity to the heathens, as they called anybody who was not Christian. And it was in this charter, this first charter, 1606, that would plant the seeds of constitutional values constitutional values. And this is a quote on this slide from that charter, that the inhabitants of the colony shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities, as if they had been abiding and born within this our realm of England. So what he is saying is that even though they venture to America and they establish a colony and they live there generation after generation, that they are to have the same rights as if they had been born in England and lived in England. This, in the future, will be very important when we get to the era of the Revolution. And they will look back at this charter and they will use this as presenting their rights to all the privileges and protections of people living in England. The image that is on this slide is the seal of the Virginia Company, front and back, and the image on there is of King James. Key terms: adventurers, men who invested their money in the Virginia Company yet stayed in England, or investors who went to North America to settle there. They were called adventurers. Charters were types of constitution, you might say a mini constitution. And plantations, that's what they call these settlements. So even before we had tobacco plantations, Jamestown was a plantation. Plymouth would be called a plantation. Massachusetts, a plantation. So in this sense, plantation simply meant the planting of a colony. So looking at Jamestown, there were approximately 120 unprepared adventurers who set out in 3 ships under the leadership of Captain Newport. And I say unprepared because over half of the 120 were aristocrats, almost half were soldiers, and then there were a few craftsmen and boys. So overwhelmingly, these are men who are not accustomed to building, not accustomed to providing food. What they expected, they have the history of the Spanish in South America and Mexico. The Spanish, when they came over, they found civilizations where there were people, there was a division of labor, which meant that there were in the city, in the empire, there were people who were farmers, agriculturalists, there were people who were builders. There was a division of labor. So when the Spanish began conquering empires in Mexico and South America, there were people there to do the work for them. People they enslaved. The Spanish enslaved. And there was also an abundance of gold and silver and other precious items. So the Spanish for 100 years had this experience in the Americas. So these men who are going to Jamestown, who are going to establish Jamestown, that's what they expect to find. They expect to find native inhabitants that'll do the work for them. And what they intend to do is to look for gold, is to find gold. Now, you might have the mistaken idea that the English colonies in America were founded by people escaping religious persecution. That is not borne out by the evidence. it is true that every colony that was established in America was established by religious people, and they took the religion with them. And they expected to convert the native inhabitants to Christianity. But as far as fleeing persecution, no one was really being put to death for their beliefs in England. There were some restrictions. For instance, the Anglican Church, the law of England was that everybody support the Church of England with their tithes, with their money, with their attendance. So it's not persecution as in fleeing for their lives. It is just that there were some restrictions on their personal practice of the religion that they didn't like. Okay? So these 120, approximately 120, according to the different accounts you read, the number varies, but basically around 120 who start out on this first expedition to America. The first 2 years, actually the first 3 years, were hard times. In fact, the first year out of those 120 that went to Jamestown to establish a settlement, in the following year there were only 35 that were still alive. And then from 1609 to 1610, it was even worse. It was called the Starving Times. There, with several other expeditions bringing more settlers in to Jamestown. In 1609, there were about 500 settlers living in the area of Jamestown. Spring of 1610, there were only 60 out of that 500 that was still alive. Now I have a quote on this slide by George Percy, and I have his image up in the right-hand corner. This is a quote. George Percy lived in Jamestown during the Starving Times, and this is what he wrote about them. Then, having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin, as dogs, cats, and mice. Settlers dug up dead corpses out of the graves to eat them, and others licked up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. Doesn't sound very pleasant, does it? Now, when they first got there, the Indians, the Powhatan Indians, assisted them with food. But the relationship between the Powhatans and the settlers deteriorated. Evidently, according to the evidence, this was a bad time even for the Powhatan Indians. Bad harvests. So there wasn't enough food, hardly, that the Indians grew and hunted to provide for themselves, much less to be able to share with the Englishmen. And recent archaeological evidence in the area of Jamestown has discovered more gruesome details of what went on during those starving times. The image in the lower left-hand corner of this PowerPoint shows men from the settlement carrying the dead outside the walls of the city, the Palisades. Also, the middle picture is a skull, which by newest forensic abilities they have reconstructed. So they have an image there of a woman's head, And the skull that they discovered there, very obviously, the flesh had been eaten off of it. And so there is definite evidence of cannibalism during the starving times. Not only digging up dead bodies, but in fact killing their weaker members and feeding from their bodies, from the flesh of their bodies. The image in the bottom right corner is the structure of the fort there at Jamestown, built in a triangular shape because the land where they had decided to create this settlement was on a kind of peninsula, so there was water on three sides. The reason they built it in a triangular shape. The men were occupied mostly with looking for gold. Again, they had this expectation because that's what the Spanish had found. So most of their time was taken up in searching for profit for gold rather than trying to feed themselves. And in fact, it would be some time, it would be months before they would even start building the fort, because they were so occupied with other things, and because those aristocrats, they weren't accustomed to doing labor. So it would be a while before they would find profit for Jamestown. We'll talk more about the Virginia Company and those men in Jamestown finding profit, but next we want to talk about the government that was established in Jamestown. So come back next time for part 2 of Jamestown, and we'll talk about the development of government in Jamestown.